The story of Horus and Set was an extremely well-known story in antiquity. It is tempting to impose the Horus and Set framework on any male rivalry story, especially if an exile is involved. But there is really only one story in the Bible that I know of that fits the mold closely enough where it seems possible to say, after analysis, that the story may have been directly based on the model of Horus and Set. When I began to realize that Esau was probably based on Set and Jacob on Horus, I knew this theory must have been explored before by others. Searching the net, one finds right away that Gary Greenberg has written an article and a book chapter on this topic, and has essentially proven the case, in my opinion, with a couple of the same connections that I also had seen. His article is called Horus, Seth, and Israel: Egyptian Literary Reflections in a Biblical Mirror, and the book chapter can be found in his The Moses Mystery. But I disagree with Greenberg regarding the rest of the patriarchs, and will be adding more connections to the Jacob and Esau parallel and bringing a whole second layer of Vedic connections to it that will complete the picture in an astonishing way. The connections that Greenberg points to are Jacob's ladder, Esau's forcing his way out of the womb early, the food trick led by the mother, the judge god Re favoring Set like Isaac favors Esau, the connection of Set to the color red, and maybe to red hair, as Esau is also connected to red hair. And the fact that the wrestling opponent of Jacob was probably actually just Esau, as we will discuss. In Greenberg's words from his article regarding the ladder parallel, quote, "Despite the murder of Osiris and the attack on Horus, Seth retained a pretty stalwart image among the Egyptians, at least until about the end of the New Kingdom, circa 1576 through 1300 BCE. He was depicted as a mighty warrior who protected Re from his enemies as the solar barge made its daily journey through the netherworld. And he is given a role in the process by which the deceased king ascends to heaven on a ladder. In Pyramid Text Utterance 478 from the 6th dynasty, Pharaoh Pepi, we read, quote, "Hail to you, ladder of the god! Hail to you, ladder of Seth! Stand up, ladder of God! Stand up, ladder of Seth! Stand up, ladder of Horus, which was made for Osiris that he might ascend on it to the sky and escort Re." And in the same utterance a little later, "Now let the ladder of God be given to me, let the ladder of Seth be given to me, that I may ascend on it to the sky and escort Re as a divine guardian of those who have gone to their doubles." Unquote. Unquote. The first clue that made me begin to seriously consider that Esau was Set, and was a true Vishnu-type parallel thus, was actually his physical description and its similarity to the description of Vrika in the Vedas, the son of Varaha Vishnu. Esau is described as hairy and red in Genesis 25:25, and he is alternately called Edom, meaning red. Meanwhile, red and hairy matches the description of the wolf or Vrika in the Vedas themselves, as Vedic Index of Names and Subjects reads, quote, "Vrika, or wolf, is mentioned frequently in the Rig Veda and also later. It was an enemy of sheep and of calves, being dangerous even to men. Its color is stated to be reddish, arunya," unquote. So Esau right away reminds of the Vishnu-related wolf of the Vedas, Vrika. This aligns with Set as well, Set being closely associated with the redness of the desert, and also to the color red generally. Set was thought to have white skin and possibly red fur or hair, though this is vague in primary sources, and red-haired enemies mentioned in pyramid texts have been interpreted by some scholars as his followers. Ancient Egypt Online claims, quote, "He was associated with the desert, which takes its name from the Egyptian word dshrt, meaning the red place. He represented the fierce, dry heat of the sun as it parched the land, and was infertile like the desert," unquote. Cuchulainn, of course, has red hair, but only in its middle layer, with the tips a lighter color and the base darker, but it is still partly red. Reading Esau as possibly Set Vishnu sets up his opponent Jacob as a possible Horus/Mitra. This starts to make a bit of sense because Horus and the Mitra type generally are the late-coming sovereigns who culminate the succession of divine kings in themselves and bring a new kind of perfected balance to the throne of the gods. Jacob, as the younger brother of Esau, is in the role of the late-comer, and when looked at within the sequence of the patriarchs, he does culminate the process initiated by Abraham, this culmination being marked by Jacob being identified with the nation of Israel itself in the climax of his story. In this context, the fact that Esau is described as rough of appearance, while Jacob is contrasted with him as smooth and described as perfect or a complete man, makes good sense. This opposition of rough and complete accurately describes the duality between Set and Horus, Horus perfecting and completing the kingship and the ennead of gods in himself. This concept also perfectly explains Jacob's name, meaning supplanter, as the Horus/Mitra type is the latecomer, who thus supplants all previous sovereigns, culminates them within himself. Zeus is more overtly said to swallow certain sovereign gods who came before him, as if internalizing them as he replaces them. Of interest might be the fact that Jacob grabs Esau's heel while they are in the womb together. This could simply be a symbol of Jacob's eventual supplanting action, but it is fascinating that the Vishnu type is sometimes associated with a deadly wound to the foot or heel as well, as if this is their vulnerable spot. Krishna, avatar of Vishnu, is shot in the foot, leading to his demise, in a similar way that Achilles has no vulnerability but in his heel. He too is finally shot there, leading to his death. Curiously, Achilles is held by the heel by his mother upon birth, in order to dip him in the river Styx to render him invincible. And due to the Krishna parallel, it's possible to theorize that Achilles has both Vishnu and Indra motifs in his legend. There is no Indra type motif that would explain this heel wounding, for instance, so it very well could be a Vishnu type motif. This is an odd similarity, then, where Achilles is held by the heel upon birth, while Esau is grabbed by the heel before birth, both moments symbolizing and foreshadowing the eventual overthrow of the boy in adulthood. What is odd about this, if it is not a mere coincidence, is the fact that Set has no heel-grabbing motif I'm aware of, and instead we have to look to Vedic and Greek parallels to find something similar. That is, unless there were more versions of Set's story available to the biblical authors at the time, a real possibility that we will have to keep firmly in mind as we go through. An incredible number of texts have been lost from the ancient world, and these could have had any of the odd details that we find now only in Indo-European parallels and can't now explain well. When we come to the details of Jacob and Esau's contendings for the inheritance of their father, and with this perspective as a foundation, the parallel really falls into place. To begin with the most uncanny piece, Jacob's mother, like Horus's, is the one who leads the charge and has the idea to trick her son's opponent, specifically with an offer of food. And this offer of food is what leads to that opponent undermining his own right to the contested inheritance, and specifically verbally. Isis turns into a hag to offer food to the ferryman to get close to Set, who she then undermines verbally, having him condemn his own right to Horus's claim with his own words. And she is also the one who gives her son Horus the scheme to put his semen on Set's lettuce, so that he will eat it and again be undermined. She is the one who literally causes her son's semen to go onto the lettuce. So she is the one behind the plot of two separate food offer tricks toward the same end. Much like the semen lettuce event, rather than being the one to perform the food trick herself, Jacob's mother tells Jacob to make red lentils or pottage and then to offer it to Esau in exchange for his birthright. So this pottage might be seen as combining some of both of the food offer motifs from Isis into one event, with her as the plotting advisor and her son carrying out the trick. Regardless, the basic motif is extremely similar to one or both of the food tricks of Isis and Horus. Once again, an interesting piece sticks out, as the pottage that tempts and undermines Esau is described as red stuff, heavily emphasizing the connection of the color to Esau's own well-established color, red. There is no established link between Set and the food offered by Isis to the ferryman, or between Set and the semen lettuce he is given by Horus, other than the fact that the lettuce is described as Set's own lettuce from his garden, and Set had tried to use his own semen as an attack on Horus first, so he has been connected to some of his own in the same story. But in the Gaelic version of the story, Cuchulainn is actually offered food that is directly reflective of his own self. He is the Hound of Ulster, and thus he is partially a hound, and he is offered hound meat, which is taboo to him since the hound is his animal. This would be like eating some of his own self or his own inner essence, and it thus inflicts magical damage on him due to the breaking of such a taboo. Similarly, Esau is tempted and eats food that is heavily connected to his own symbolic essence by its red color. Once again, red is the color of the Vedic wolf itself, Vrika, so it is possible to read Esau eating the red pottage as similar to Cuchulainn eating the meat of the actual hound, which symbolizes himself. Again, nothing in particular connects the food offers given to Set to his own essence in this same way, at least in existing versions of his tale. Maybe there was a version that did connect him to the food. We don't know. We must consider then if this is a coincidence or if a similar connection of Set to the offered food might have existed in lost variants that the Bible authors knew. Regardless, the tricky offer of the food to undermine the opponent, especially driven by the mother, marks an uncanny parallel between the stories of Jacob and Horus and the other Vishnu parallels we have noted. But there is far more. With these uncanny parallels in place, and with some more in-depth knowledge of the Egyptian story, I realize that the scene of Isaac giving his blessings to Jacob and Esau is well paralleled within Horus and Set's mythos, and the more esoteric rites connected to them within Egyptian tradition. Firstly, the blessing scene is when Jacob is finally formalized as the victor in the struggle for the inheritance, with his father Isaac finally blessing him to inherit his lands. Horus and Set are assessed and judged at a couple different points in their contendings, sometimes by the gods as a group, the Ennead, led by Re-Harakti, as in the Chester Beatty Papyrus, the main version we have, and alternately by Geb, the earth god, in the Shabaka stone version. But at one of the final judgments related in the Chester Beatty Papyrus, Thoth steps forward from among the other gods as the scribe of truth to assess who has impregnated whom with their seed. To call forth the seed from within them, which is the mark of dominance, Thoth specifically places his hands on the shoulder of Horus. This allows him to call the seed and see whether or not it is within him. Quote, "Then Thoth, lord of script and scribe of truth for the Ennead, put his hand on Horus's shoulder and said, 'Come out, your semen of Seth,' and it answered from the water in the interior of the marsh. Thoth put his hand on Seth's shoulder and said, 'Come out, your semen of Horus.' Then it said to him, 'Where shall I come from?' Thoth said to it, 'Come out from his ear.' Thereupon it said to him, 'Is it from the ear that I should issue forth, seeing that I am divine seed?' etc." Unquote. Very coincidentally, Isaac's blessing of Jacob specifically involves Isaac feeling Jacob's arms, putting his hands on Jacob's arms to feel if he is Esau and thus the firstborn. This is the decisive test that leads to Jacob finally winning the blessing of his father, which promises his right, as the placing of hands on Horus's arms by Thoth also leads to a decision by Thoth that, quote, "Horus is right and Seth is wrong," unquote. Still, both judgments only grant the right. They don't fully settle the dispute, since in both cases, Set or Esau continues to resist and fight for a little longer. In addition, both moments are specifically the result of Jacob or Horus having changed their hands in some way. While Horus has had his hands cut off by his mother and replaced to hide the residue of Set's seed, so instead Jacob has been advised by his mother to cover his hands and neck with goat skins so that they will feel hairy, as if replacing them with a semblance of Esau's hands and arms, making him feel like the firstborn Esau to his blind father. Genesis 27:16 reads, quote, "And the skins of the young goats she put on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck," unquote. When Isaac feels his son's hands and finds them hairy, he specifically comments that he has Esau's hands but Jacob's voice in Genesis 27:22 through 23. And he specifically repeats that it is the changed hands of Jacob that make him think he is Esau, and thus lead him to bestowing the superior blessing on him. Quote, "And he did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy, like his brother Esau's hands, so he blessed him." Unquote. Thus, while the hand-severing scene found in other Mitra-type parallels is absent from Jacob, he has instead a hand-switching scene, a hand and arm disguising scene, which closely matches the moment of Horus's hand-switching and accomplishes the same exact goal, but without blood. Both Horus and Isaac can be said to switch the appearance of their arms and hands in order to win the dominion they seek, both events entailing a degree of trickery as such, Horus's trickery being to hide the fact that his hands had been tainted by the seed, and Jacob's to make himself out to be the firstborn, both hiding something about their hands or arms in order to ultimately win the right for themselves. Therefore, the blessing of Isaac may be seen as most closely paralleling the test and judgment of Thoth, involving the hand on the shoulder and the calling of the seed. However, I believe more may be going on in Isaac's scene. More seems to be compressed into the blessing that Isaac gives. Because Horus's father is Osiris, not Thoth, and so Isaac giving his son the blessing, and specifically by kissing him, may necessarily be combining this judgment of Thoth scene with the separate passing of the throne from Osiris to his son Horus, found in other Egyptian texts, and also hinted at the end of the Chester Beatty papyrus version where Osiris sends a letter from the underworld. I think you will see what I mean. In particular, when one digs into the esoteric material regarding the ascension of Horus to the throne of his father Osiris, one finds further strong alignments, and these lead to even more uncanny parallels within Jacob's story as it unfolds from this point. This is from a description of a coronation ritual for the king, in which he is made to embody Horus as he accepts the embrace and the throne of his father Osiris, found in the pyramid texts, the oldest texts from ancient Egypt. This is from Jeremy Nadler's Shamanic Wisdom in the Pyramid Texts. Note how the king is even made to wear a special garment before accepting Osiris's embrace, slightly reminiscent of Jacob wearing hairy goat skins on his body as he accepts the blessing. Quote, "What occurs next is the most significant part of the ritual. It begins with a lector, priest, bringing a special garment called a keni, Qeni, worn over the chest and back and knotted at the shoulder, which is then placed on the king. The text identifies the keni with Osiris. It is filled with the spiritual potency of Osiris. So as this garment is placed over the king, it signifies the ritual union or embrace of the Horus king and Osiris. The king says, 'I have embraced this my father, who has become tired, so that he may become quite healthy again.' The embrace is protective of Osiris, restoring to him health and strength, but it is also a mutual act that has an invigorating and renewing effect on the Horus king, as we shall see. It is worth dwelling on the meaning of this embrace, for it really is the kernel of the whole ceremony. According to Frankfurt, we should understand that it is, quote, no mere sign of affection, but a true fusion, a communion between two living spirits, unio mystica, unquote, Frankfurt implies that the two archetypes or archetypal energies of Osiris and Horus are at this moment virtually indistinguishable, for what occurs is essentially an inner event in the consciousness of the king, an awareness that his royal power arises from this mystical fusion of the two archetypes within his own being. Osiris, the archetype of death and renewal, and Horus, the archetype of the reborn human spirit. Frankfurt describes this phase in the ceremonies as, quote, an excellent example of those rites de passage which guide man's personality from an earlier to a new state of life, unquote, unquote. And then, quote, these Osirian phases are then followed by Horus arising as king, presumably through a coronation ceremony, and at the same time, quote, in the embrace of his father Osiris, unquote. Now these sources describing the mystical embrace of Horus and Osiris in a coronation ceremony are closely paralleled in the pyramid texts. There is, for example, a passage in the pyramid texts that presents the embrace of Osiris and Horus as having an utterly transformative effect on the Horus king. Through the embrace, he becomes a shining spirit, Akh, AKH. O Osiris, this is Horus in your embrace, and he protects you. He has become Akh through you, in your identity of the Akhet, from which the sun emerges. Unquote. Note that while Osiris embraces Horus and unifies with him thus, in Genesis 27, 26 through 27, it is specifically said that Isaac kisses Jacob before his blessing. Also right after he feels his arms. Quote, then his father Isaac said to him, come near me and kiss me, my son. So he came near and kissed him. And Isaac smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him, unquote. This being followed by Isaac's blessing, where he asks God to give him plenty and great dominion. This kiss and coming near is then very close to the emphasized embrace of Osiris and the new king Horus. Isaac and Jacob then eat a meal from the goats that Jacob has brought Isaac, whereas the rite of Osiris ends with a huge feast. Quote, with a huge feast in which, of course, the living king is the main participant, unquote. Isaac's blessing to Esau comes after the blessing to Jacob. But while the blessing to Jacob said that all his brothers would be servants to him, Esau's blessing emphasizes a prophecy that Esau will break out of Jacob's yoke. This imagery is strongly reminiscent of Set being brought in chains, subdued under the kingship of Horus after Horus is judged the winner, and also of the various prophecies regarding the future destruction of the other Vishnu types when they finally will break free. For after Fenrir is bound, the prophecy says he will break free at Ragnarok to kill Odin. Typhon's jaws of flame are said to one day break out again in the future despite his imprisonment. Cuchulainn is also prophesied by the Morrigan to wreak bloody destruction on his opposing Connacht men during the conclusion of the Tanbokulnya. Thus, the framing of Esau as yoked under Jacob's servitude but prophesied to break free one day jumps out at one in this context. Quote, when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him, and Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob, unquote. Genesis 27, 40 through 41. Notably, Esau specifically seeks to kill Jacob, making Esau seem like an unleashed Set/Vishnu type indeed, and this causes Jacob to have to flee into exile. Shortly following these events, we are given the Jacob's ladder scene, his erecting of a pillar, and the scene of the divine man, or Elohim, wrestling Jacob in the night. But it seems that near identical events follow the embrace of Horus by Osiris in the aforementioned rite. After Osiris has embraced Horus, but before the great feast, in this case, a ladder to heaven appears, specifically a ladder to heaven, which the dying Osiris climbs. The ladder to heaven that Jacob sees almost right after fleeing in the aftermath of Isaac's blessing, then seems far too coincidentally positioned here. In both cases, these are ladders to heaven, though Osiris climbs the ladder in his version, while only angels climb Jacob's ladder, with God appearing at the top. This would only be part of the monotheizing and euhemerizing of the story, of course. It may be of interest, though, that God in this vision essentially repeats the blessing of Isaac that he will have great dominion and offspring, but now coming from the divine level. Quote, "The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. Thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land, for I will not leave thee, until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of." Unquote. Genesis 27, 13-15. In the Osiris rite, as Nadler explains, quote, "Then the king orders certain priests, called the embracers of the Akh, or shining spirit, who wear jackal and baboon masks, to create a great ladder that reaches up to the sky. And it is on this ladder that the Osiris king now ascends. As the king climbs, the priests swing clubs to drive back Seth, an action that at the same time appears to produce the rungs of the ladder. This ladder, then, is partly symbolic, but it probably did exist physically in some form, so that the king's ascent as an awakened Osiris was dramatically enacted. Climbing up to the sky on a ladder or stairway is typical of shamanic rituals, for which many examples can be found worldwide. It is interesting, therefore, that references to the ascent of the king to the sky by means of a ladder are also to be found in the pyramid texts, once again linking them both with the kingship ritual of the Ramesseum dramatic papyrus and a typically shamanic motif. With this ascent of the Osiris king, the ritual now draws to a close." Unquote. The rite then ending with the aforementioned feast. Jacob then raises the stone he has slept on as a sacred pillar and anoints it to mark the place as the house of God. Subsequently, in Jacob's exile, he is approached by some sort of divine man in the night and they wrestle. But both of these events, too, are nearly perfectly paralleled in other parts of the very Osiris rite we have been discussing, which also includes the ladder to heaven and the embrace from the Father Sovereign. As Nadler says of these moments, quote, "The use of asses symbolizes Seth's subordination to Osiris, and this theme is taken further with the raising of the Jed column, witnessed by the king and signifying the demise of Seth. Offerings are now made to Horus, and a fight, possibly a wrestling match, between the, quote, children of Horus, unquote, and the, quote, followers of Seth, unquote, is enacted, with the victory going to Horus, unquote. This fight or wrestling match was known in one of its iterations as the Edfu drama, associated with a yearly performance of this sacred drama at the Temple of Edfu. So the embrace from the Father to pass along the sovereign blessing, the ladder to heaven also echoing this blessing but on the divine level, the raising of a sacred pillar right after this, and a fight, possibly a wrestling match. It seems as though Jacob's story was drawing not only from the usual contendings of Horus and Seth's story that we know today, in the versions we have, but was directly including motifs from the rites surrounding the coronation of Horus. As one way or another, this particular sequence of motifs within the Jacob story are also essentially impossible to explain without acknowledging their Egyptian context and indeed source. With the judgment of Thoth and the other gods upon Horus from the contending's narrative, and the embrace and bestowal of the shining spirit and throne from the Osiris rite, we explain almost all of the elements of the Isaac blessing scene together, with the result that Isaac appears to be playing a sort of Osiris/Thoth composite role here, with the other gods who judge Horus, the rightful ruler, at other moments such as Geb and Re echoing in the background of Isaac. After all, we have seen the tendency for biblical stories to composite and simplify elements from more than one figure into their patriarchal characters, as was the case with Moses, who is Dadhichi, Vasistha, and Vishvamitra. I say almost all of the elements from this scene are explained on purpose. There are still oddities that stand out and that work almost at cross purposes with the Horus-type narrative that clearly forms the foundation of Jacob's story. What I mean is this. In Horus's story, neither Osiris nor Thoth nor any of the other gods is blind like Isaac. And so this ailment plays no part in the judgment, other than Horus himself being temporarily blinded by Set, which appears a completely different thing. And when Horus is finally judged, he directly rules at that moment, at least after the final judgment, and there is no exile. There was an exile of the child Horus at the beginning of his story, instead, just after his birth. This is true. But as mentioned, this may have belonged to a separate god mythos from the elder Horus originally, and also was when he was a newborn, with these stories only being combined over time. Thus, the exile of Jacob is very much at the wrong moment to directly parallel the exile of child Horus, which happens before the fights with Set, though it could be argued to still be a more general or partial parallel motif, a similar echo from a similar god type. At the point where Thoth judges Horus to be in the right, which might more directly match the point where Isaac blesses Jacob, as explained, the contending between Horus and Set still isn't quite over, however, just as it isn't over between Jacob and Set. As such, the hostile statement of Esau after his father's blessing could be a more direct parallel of this particular moment where Set too reacts to the judgment against him, as Genesis 27:41 reads, quote, Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, The days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then will I slay my brother Jacob. Unquote. Set, right after being judged in the wrong by Thoth's seed test, also becomes furious and immediately challenges his brother once more, as Esau similarly threatens his brother here. Quote, Seth became exceedingly furious and let out a loud shriek when they said, Horus is right and Seth is wrong. And so Seth took a great oath by the god as follows, He shall not be awarded the office until he has been dismissed outside with me, and we build for ourselves some stone ships and race each other. Unquote. You can see that they both take a sort of vow to challenge their rival once more. But even if this moment makes a good parallel with similar enraged challenges brought by both Esau and Set as reaction to the blessing or judgment, still the narratives take off in very different directions at this point. It's true that the ladder of Jacob, the pillar he sets up, and the wrestling match seem plausibly to be part of the Egyptian material source, but the exile of Jacob right at this point, as well as what goes on during that exile, the Laban episode, has no parallel in the Horus myth. Set challenges his brother to build stone ships and race them at this parallel moment. Jacob, on the other hand, goes into exile, running from Esau, who is threatening his life, and finds a wife and has the whole episode of staying with his uncle Laban. Furthermore, while Horus engages in some trickery to put his seed in Set and remove it from his own hands, thus paralleling Jacob's trickery in wearing the goatskins on his hands, Jacob's trickery is a full deceit of the judge, who is also his own father. Horus deceives Set, yes, but he is direct and honest to Thoth, the judge, insofar as he genuinely has no more seed upon him at this point. He has truly been the dominator of Set in this particular tricky skirmish by his own cunning and resourcefulness. This goes along with the fact, already mentioned, that Thoth and the other gods are not really tricked here, and are certainly not tricked due to their blindness. There is no blindness. Therefore, the blindness of Isaac and its role in the judgment, along with the exile at this particular point, do not fit the Egyptian model. The change casts Jacob as even more deceptive than Horus is, and Isaac as more foolishly deceived, significant changes in their characters. So why the changes? Where did this narrative come from? The Egyptian model cannot explain them, at least in any version we know of. Are these additional motifs native to the Hebrew tradition? A literary invention? This particular riddle has a more complete solution than either of these options, and this solution builds on the awareness earned from our Moses parallel. That is, that the biblical authors knew Vedic texts, or extremely Vedic-like traditions, and actively made composites using this Vedic material. With this perspective, the solution indeed appears. There is in fact a narrative, only one, that has the exact set of motifs needed to explain the motifs of Jacob's story that go beyond the Egyptian Horus, Set, and Osiris framework we have laid out. When you take this one other narrative and add it to the Egyptian base, you have almost perfectly made the Jacob story's narrative structure with two relatively clean and consistent chunks. And this second narrative is from the Indian Mahabharata, one of the primary sources used for the Moses story as well, as we have shown. Those who know the Mahabharata story may end up wondering how they didn't see this before when it has been explained. Firstly, as Georges Dumézil has explained, and as my book and videos have supported many times over, the once and future king Yudhishthira is an incarnation of Mitra, despite becoming assimilated to Yama in Indian tradition over time due to their overlap in the god called Dharma. Indeed, he is the most significant incarnation of Mitra, directly carrying Mitra's myths in his story, and provides a much more full Mitra-type mythos within Indian tradition than the god Mitra himself even does, as Mitra's direct myths apparently got reduced and half forgotten sometime during the Vedic period. Even in the Rig Veda, Mitra himself has evidence of being reduced. In the main inciting action of his story, and one of the most famous events of the epic, after performing the Rajasuya sacrifice as part of his coronation, Yudhishthira is invited to a dice game by his enemy, Duryodhana. Dhritarashtra, Duryodhana's father, is the presiding authority at the game, which takes place in his court under his watch. Duryodhana and Shakuni, the opponents of Yudhishthira, use magically loaded dice, and due to Dhritarashtra's blindness, he isn't able to detect the cheating, allowing the game to proceed unfairly. He is essentially the judge, but he is being duped. The result of the game is that Yudhishthira, the rightful heir to the throne, is dispossessed of his kingdom and wife, and specifically must go into exile from this moment. So a blind king allows a trick to occur under his watch, which dispossesses the rightful heir to the rulership. His blindness, specifically in allowing the dispossession trick to proceed, defines this motif. Dumézil describes Dhritarashtra's inaction as symbolic of destiny passively allowing events to take their course, Dhritarashtra being the incarnation of Bhaga, god of allotment and destiny, broadly speaking. As mentioned, this deceitful dice game leads to the immediate exile of Yudhishthira and his brothers. This matches the moment of exile of Jacob, which happens as direct result of the blindness trick of Jacob and Isaac, appearing right after the blessing of the sons in the text. For his exile, Jacob is ultimately sent to live with and work for Laban, his maternal uncle. While there, Jacob is given a peculiar form of employment as a herdsman of Laban's flocks. In Genesis 30:25-43, Laban initially stipulates Jacob can take all speckled, spotted, and striped animals from the flock as wages, assuming most offspring will be solid-colored. Jacob agrees, but manipulates the breeding by using peeled rods with stripes in front of stronger mating animals, somehow magically producing marked offspring for himself thus, while weaker ones breed without rods, yielding solid-colored young for Laban. Laban, seeing Jacob's success, changes the deal multiple times. See Genesis 31:7-8. First to only speckled, then only spotted, then only striped. Each time Jacob adapts by adjusting the rod strategy, placing them selectively to match the new stipulation, ensuring the stronger animals produce the specified markings. He repeats this, consistently outmaneuvering Laban, growing his flock with the healthiest marked animals. It is clear that God is helping Jacob to win these wages. This is a very unique and even strange sequence, with a strong feeling of the Israelite pastoral setting. As such, it may appear to be very difficult to compare it to any known stories from elsewhere. This was my impression until the user and commenter by the name of Ben pointed out that, like the dice game of Dhritarashtra, this episode essentially is an episode of divinely influenced gambling. When Laban lies out the wager, his stipulations, Jacob outplays him by divinely aided strategy, and wins the pot each time, gradually enriching himself from Laban's wealth. The problem is, not only has the dice scene already been paralleled by the blind blessing trick, but again Jacob in exile parallels Yudhishthira in exile, and Yudhishthira was the great loser of the dice game under the blind king. However, Yudhishthira doesn't only play the dice game where he loses and gets exiled with the blind king. In the final year of his exile, he and his brothers must take up work at the court of another king, Virata, while disguised. Yudhishthira's employment is specifically gambling with the king. He is hired to be the king's companion and specifically to play dice with him all throughout the year. Not only this, but the text describes how Yudhishthira was so skilled that he always won against the king, and in doing so, he gained wealth that he and his brothers were able to live on. Wealth won from gambling with the king's wealth. Quote, Yudhishthira, as courtier, made himself agreeable to Virata and his sons, and also to all the Matsyas. An adept in the mysteries of dice, the son of Pandu, that is Yudhishthira, caused them to play at dice according to his pleasure, and made them sit together in the dice hall like a row of birds bound in a string. And that tiger among men, King Yudhishthira, the just, unknown to the monarch, distributed among his brothers in due proportion the wealth he won from Virata. And Bhimasena, Yudhishthira's brother, on his part, sold to Yudhishthira for price meat and viands of various kinds which he obtained from the king. And Arjuna distributed among all his brothers the proceeds of worn-out clothes which he earned in the inner apartments of the palace. And Sahadeva, too, who was disguised as a cowherd, gave milk, curds, and clarified butter to his brothers. And Nakula also shared with his brothers the wealth the king gave him, satisfied with his management of the horses. Unquote. From Virata Parva, section 13, Samayapalana Parva. And we even see the youngest brother taking care of horses, similar to Jacob's employment. Also, quote, Alas, he who, while sojourning, was followed by 10,000 elephants, adorned with golden garlands, that is Yudhishthira, now supports himself by casting dice. Unquote. From Virata Parva, section 18. Now the whole arc of the Yudhishthira parallel comes into view within Jacob's story, and we realize the blindness of Isaac, the exile of Jacob right after the blindness trick, his employment with Laban, and his repeated winning of a certain kind of gambling game against Laban, resulting in him enriching himself from Laban's wealth specifically, is all one story block, one coherent piece taken from a single source. Only the Mahabharata has these specific exact motifs in exactly this order, and the dice game under the blind king's watch and subsequent exile are some of the most well-known events from this whole ancient epic. The combination of these uncanny motifs in precisely the same order shows us basically what happened in the Genesis composition. An Egyptian base narrative was combined with a second narrative arc adapted from the Mahabharata, the tricking of the blind king to disinherit the true heir, the exile and gambling against the host during that time to gain wealth, right before returning to reclaim the rightful dominion. The main pieces that weren't explained in the Egyptian model all are found and explained together in one additional source, and this has been overlooked due to the fact that Vedic influence on the Old Testament has been seen as too unlikely prior to now. In combining these two stories, with the junction point essentially being the blessing scene, some disjunctions were left behind. causing a seam to still be visible. These disjunctions are now explicable in view of the composite model that I put forward. Jacob is mainly the Yudhishthira Mitra type. Even Horus is the accurate parallel of Yudhishthira Mitra, the eventual rightful king who brings about completion and stability after some contendings and trials. So Jacob is primarily Mitraic either way. But it is Duryodhana, the demonic opponent of Yudhishthira, who uses the dice trick under the radar of the blind king at the dice game, his own father. And it is Yudhishthira who is the great loser who loses the kingdom, his rightful inheritance, from this trick. Jacob in his story is the one to deceive the blind king, his own father, and to disinherit his brother, the true firstborn, the true rightful king. But Jacob isn't really Duryodhana in the rest of his mythos, Duryodhana being the incarnation of the demon Kali. Jacob then is immediately exiled despite winning, returning him to the Yudhishthira arc that continues with the Laban episode. But it is Horus who wins the judgment at the judgment of Thoth and the blessing of Osiris. Thus, the Egyptian model laid the expectation that Jacob must win the right in this scene. The Egyptian foundation set the idea in place that Jacob would win the right in this moment. Therefore, when the blind king trick was added here from the Mahabharata, Jacob as Horus fit more with Duryodhana's role, the winner in that trick. Because Horus won out in the Egyptian moment, Jacob had to win out in this added Mahabharata motif that was fused together with it at this seam. This dissonance in this moment is explained by the two-source model, and we can see the layers coming together at this turning point. Hence, Jacob seems like Duryodhana for a moment, but then quickly is exiled, thus continuing as a Yudhishthira type, which typologically remains consistent with Horus as well. The same more or less is true for Isaac in this scene. I have already described how Isaac takes the roles of Thoth and Osiris with echoes of the other judging gods like Re in this moment. But the blind king motif is not part of the Egyptian model. It comes from the blind king trick as part of the Mahabharata source. But as Osiris Thoth, Isaac is not quite the same type as Dhritarashtra, who is the incarnate god of destiny and allotment. Bhaga, a different god type. Thus, another disjunction becomes apparent, another seam, this time within the character of Isaac himself. Two different scenes have been combined in the Genesis tricking and blessing scene, and this overlaying of scenes results in very interesting but ultimately trackable contradictions within Isaac and Jacob as character types. In sum, the disjunction between these sources reveals the stitching. Isaac's blindness fits Dhritarashtra, enabling Jacob's trick. But Jacob isn't really a Duryodhana-type usurper, exploiting weakness for greed. He should be Yudhishthira, as in the rest of his mythos, exiled yet triumphant through patience and skill. And indeed, despite performing the trick, he is exiled right afterward and takes the Yudhishthira exile arc. Thus, he switches from a Duryodhana in this moment to a Yudhishthira role in rapid succession. Isaac, too, isn't fully Dhritarashtra or Osiris, but a blend of both. Both the loving father embracing his son and passing on to him the kingship, and also the tricked blind king. This mismatch betrays a composite. Egyptian story structure and kingship rites, Horus versus Set, Thoth and Re's judgment, Osiris's blessing, graft onto Mahabharata, blind king trick, exile and return motifs, Dhritarashtra's folly, Yudhishthira versus Duryodhana. The seam widens when looking at narrative logic. Isaac's Osiris-like embrace of his son clashes with the Dhritarashtra-like befooled passivity. Jacob's deception of the paternal lord clashes with Yudhishthira's being the one losing out from the trick, never tricking the lord, let alone his own father, as Duryodhana does. These gaps Jacob as Horus/Yudhishthira but also Duryodhana, Isaac as Osiris but also Dhritarashtra, evidence a narrative that may have been patched together from two distinct but coherent segments, its Egyptian and Indic threads pulling apart at the blessing's pivot. This is what it would look like if two stories were combined and roles were shifted to make these overlaid pieces fit. We touched only briefly on the scene of Jacob wrestling the divine being in the night. Clearly, when taken as a piece with the other Egyptian ritual motifs, this scene appears to come from the fight between Set and Horus, which may have been portrayed as a wrestling match in the drama at Edfu, according to Nadler and his sources. This means that regardless of who the Genesis text has changed the opponent into, underlying this figure was probably originally the Set-type opponent, who is, of course, Esau, ultimately. But the specific motif in the wrestling match of Jacob suggests why the picture may have been blurred. The picture is undoubtedly blurred now, as commentators still can't agree about whether the wrestling opponent is an angel or a god, or if Jacob is injured in the thigh or the hip. The original Hebrew text uses the word yarek, Y-A-R-E-K, which means thigh. Specifically, Genesis 32:25 states the injury was to the, quote, hollow of his yarek, unquote, while modern translations like the NIV use hip to point to the femur joint. The original language consistently refers to the thigh, yarek. According to Strong's Hebrew lexicon, yarek refers particularly to the thigh or the loins. One event of Horus and Set's contendings does in fact match an attack on the thigh specifically. It is in the thighs where the text says Horus is penetrated by Set's penis when he attempts to mark him with his seed. The text reads, quote, "During the night, Seth caused his phallus to become stiff and inserted it between Horus's thighs. Then Horus placed his hands between his thighs and received Seth's semen," unquote. Jacob's wrestling match is also, notably, specifically during the night. His wound is in the thigh, the exact place where Set penetrates Horus. If the biblical authors were trying to clean up what they saw as an embarrassing or indecent story, it would explain why the scene is so shrouded and confusing, like the eraser marks have been left behind from the removal of key details, and what is left is now hazy and unclear. The haze of unclarity then simply gets passed off and interpreted as the haze of God's mystery. A well-informed user and commenter by the name of Ben has also raised to me the likelihood that the wrestling opponent was really Esau originally, at least at the earliest layer of the story. As he put it in our informal discussion, quote, "Without identifying the opponent as divine, the story reads quite differently. Jacob hears that Esau is coming to meet him with an army, and, since the last time they were together, Esau was planning to kill Jacob in revenge for stealing their father's blessing, Jacob is frightened. Then, in the dark of the night, a man appears and fights Jacob to a standstill. The story has previously established that Jacob is unusually strong. In Genesis 29:10, he single-handedly rolls a large stone that otherwise takes multiple shepherds to move. 29:2-3. Who should we expect to be able to fight Jacob so, and who should be motivated to attack him but his own twin brother? The story does not tell us whether the man was Esau, but when Esau appears in daylight, he is entirely friendly. Jacob still does not trust him, however, and makes an excuse to avoid following him back to Mount Seir. In the aftermath, Esau peacefully accepts his loss of birthright and withdraws to the land of Edom," unquote. In my opinion, these considerations explain much and suggest layers of editing that left us with the story as it now appears. Gary Greenberg also argues that the divine wrestler is really Esau in his earlier cited article, saying, quote, "Eventually, the gods were fed up and Seth promised peace, offering to host a dinner for Horus. After dinner, during the night, Seth raped Horus and intended to use this act as proof that he should be king and not Horus. When Isis learned what happened, she used assorted magic tricks to make it appear that it was Horus who raped Seth, rather than the other way around. In the Jacob-Esau saga, Jacob makes a return trip to his homeland and fears having to go past Esau's territory. When he comes nearby, Esau appears with an army but offers peace and invites Jacob to a banquet. Jacob accepts the invitation and tells Esau to ride ahead and he'll join him. But as soon as Esau departs, Jacob, fearing his brother's true intentions, scoots home and never shows up to smoke the peace pipe. The biblical story seems to be a truncated continuation of the Egyptian storyline that eliminates what would have been the rape of Jacob had a full parallel been presented. However, just before the meeting between Jacob and Esau, Jacob has a nighttime wrestling match with a mysterious figure, Genesis 32, 22 through 32, that leaves him lame. When he wakes up in the morning, he sees Esau and the approaching army. I suspect a strong literary connection between Jacob's struggle with the mysterious stranger and Horus's struggle with Set, both events taking place before or right around, a peace offering of a banquet. The contendings of Horus and Seth are not necessarily the only story version of the contest between the two gods. It is just the only one that has come down to us. Other traditions with other story details may have circulated, unquote. And even in the 11th century, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, who lived from 1040 to 1105, the foremost commentator on the Torah and the Talmud, explained that the man who wrestled with Jacob until daybreak was Esau's guardian angel, thus registering how closely connected the wrestler evidently was to Esau. Yitzhaki says Esau's guardian angel. We say Esau's own divine persona. Clearly, the wrestler mirrors and echoes the role of Esau in his contendings with Jacob and in Jacob's need for his brother's blessing and ultimate truce, as he needs the blessing of this divine wrestler. But these are intensified into a mystical form, brought to the divine level right at the climax of the brothers' conflict. Another commentator, Martin Allen Campbell, in his article Jacob Wrestles Esau, Disguise, Double Meaning, and Deceit in Genesis 32, 24 through 32, from 2014, argues, quote, that neither God nor angel are possible opponents for Jacob because the implausibility of Jacob's earnestly overcoming an angel, the general incongruity of the Yahweh character behaving as the combatant does, and the lack of direct textual cues to substantiate that Jacob wrestles a lesser deity or demon. Instead, Esau is more likely to be Jacob's opponent because Esau has motive, is connected to the man with the phrase, quote, the face of God, unquote, follows similar speech patterns, and behaves craftily in his meeting with Jacob, unquote. Remember that Esau is the humanized form of an Egyptian god, and so the wrestling opponent being called an Elohim, a deity, is not out of place when a god is in fact there in the underlying source being adapted. Essentially, Set here would be getting half assimilated to the Hebrew god or Elohim concept, as also happens with other gods in the Pentateuch, as the text converts a multiplicity of gods into a single one. But the wrestler's identity, as also based on the god Set, was either obscured during the process of composition or later revision, leaving the thigh injury as a euphemism for the original thigh penetration of Horus. Still, this thigh injury oddly caused or was connected to some kind of taboo or impurity that is now said in the Bible to attach to a custom of not eating this part of the animal. But I would ask, if a divinity touched a certain spot on one's body, why would this make it impure rather than sanctified? A mark of bravery, a battle scar from God, if the touch was not itself of an impure sort. The divine haze of mystery now covers all of this erasing and euphemizing, leaving us with the mystical but still intensely charged nighttime encounter we have in Genesis today. Some other scholars have also noted strong connections, strong echoes of the wrestling match between Gilgamesh and Enkidu as well, which should be noted here. See Esther J. Hamori's work, So this Gilgamesh wrestling scene could have been in the biblical author's minds as well. It should be noted that Typhon does in fact cut the sinews of Zeus's hands, but also of his feet, leaving him immobilized for a time, while Yudhishthira has his floating chariot lose its magical floating power, resulting thus in a limitation of its previous mobility, after he participates in a trick to disarm an enemy. These motifs are not as close to Jacob's thigh injury as the Horus thigh penetration motif is, but they can provide other points to compare to for Jacob's thigh injury and limp within the larger Mitra-type mythos. Furthermore, if the thigh penetration interpretation is not liked, Greenberg points out that Plutarch, a late source, describes Harpocrates, a child Horus separate from the elder Horus in his telling, as being born weak in the legs. Although the context of this detail doesn't fit our comparison quite as well, it's certainly worth noting and could have been a detail relevant to the biblical author if that version was known to them at the time. We should add that Menelaus, another Mitra type, with his men helping, also wrestles and has to subdue a shape-changing seer god named Proteus in order to get from him not a blessing, but another important spoken utterance. Information about how Menelaus can return home. Note that Jacob is exiled and trying to return home too, and the blessing of the Elohim seems to allow him to finally do so. Cuchulainn, remember, is also a Shirite, S-I-R-I-T-E, a shapeshifter, and as the being that Jacob fights is an Elohim, so Proteus is indeed a god. Is there some similar echo or a linkage here to a shared theme? In context of all these clear parallels, even the moment where the exiled Jacob becomes afraid of the approaching Esau and tries to send out pacifying gifts to him reminds us a bit of parallel scenes in other Vishnu-type myths. However, again oddly, these aren't necessarily present in the surviving versions of the Egyptian tale of Set that we have. Jacob tries to send out several flocks of animals to the enraged Esau as gifts, the biblical passage naming 3 leaders of herds, but then also vaguely suggesting others as well. So the number is not exactly grouped as 3, but there is this vague 3 naming that is mentioned. Meanwhile, the enraged Cuchulainn approaching Conchobar's fortress strikes fear in the people who see him coming, leading Conchobar to send out a group of women to bare their breasts at him, and then 3 vats of cold water to successively submerge him in, finally pacifying him. Fenrir, on the other hand, is fettered by 3 successive containment fetters to finally pacify him in his myth. So either this is a coincidence, or there is an odd echo of a Cuchulainn-like pacification of the approaching enraged Vishnu parallel in a comparable moment, though Conchobar's pacifications of Cuchulainn are not gifts. While Yudhishthira is in exile at the court of King Virata, their enemies, including Duryodhana and Drona sometimes paralleling the Vishnu type, though a different type himself, their enemies do in fact find out that they may be present there and launch an attack on the court. Thus they are feared and they are approaching the exiled Yudhishthira and his brothers. But this approaching attack is met with battle by Yudhishthira and his brothers, and no gifts or other pacifications are sent out to try to intercept them. Thus, again, the motif does not quite match what we have in the biblical story. What we can say is that this scene of pacification gifts has a general similarity to other moments in the broader myth type, but that it does not exactly match any that I'm aware of, leaving us with yet another mystery. Such mysteries as aforesaid could be resolved by the existence of alternate versions of the Egyptian or Indian tale during the time of biblical composition, or from other literary compositing using additional sources that we haven't pinned down. But nonetheless, these remain as mysteries. They could also suggest a deeper ancient hybridity of Indo-European traditions with ancient Israelite traditions that we can't entirely follow. But now the million-dollar question. If it was an Egyptian literary model, Horus and Set, with a Mahabharata plotline welded onto it, the blind king tricked, the exile, the Laban gambling episode, then what on earth was the motivation for doing specifically this? Why not just retell the Horus story in their own way and leave it at that? They really wanted the exile and return plot to emphasize the process of refinement and intellect or chosenness of Jacob. They appreciated its esoteric or dramatic dimension as allegory of the soul of the king and its development, or saw some political dimension of this plotline that they wanted to harness, that they needed for their purposes. Or they wanted to conceal the origin of the Egyptian layer, and combining two separate stories, including a more exotic and distant story that people wouldn't know, helps to do that, forging a new story that they can call their own in their own milieu. Combining two stories certainly helps to obscure the origin source and make the final product more original. But I still feel like I'm missing something in terms of why they added the Mahabharata plotline instead of just retelling the Horus story in their own style. They blended these stories so artfully and with great effort. But why exactly? This is similar to the Moses question, of course, the question of why he is a combination of Dadhichi, Vasista, and Vishvamitra, rather than just being based on one. And in that issue, it seemed almost like the authors just wanted to combine the best parts of the similar sages into one to make the ultimate sage hero. As if they just saw the potency of making a sort of greatest hits from 2 or 3 instances of a certain type. That seems at least in part to be how the authors worked. As if they said, take the best parts of these Vedic and Egyptian sources of a given type and combine them. Add relevant Hebrew customs and laws on top and in the gaps. But to theorize a bit more on this question, I suppose if defining oneself as a nation is the goal or one of the goals, which Jacob as being named Israel itself certainly brings to the front, then the Horus plot isn't necessarily dramatically powerful enough to drive that particular goal home. The exile and return plot adds something emphatic toward this goal of self-definition. As Gad Barnea has described regarding the Moses tradition, the Hebrew intelligentsia of Alexandria was having to combat negative stories about their people within the Alexandria society during the 3rd century BCE, and thus were having to create polemics against these negative stories that began circling about them. It is also interesting how the Horus the child plot does indeed have the exile and return portion of the plot, but it would be before the blessing event when Horus was still a newborn or child. That Horus exile part of the plot still is kind of being echoed in the Jacob story then, but as we have seen, his exile is clearly more of the Mahabharata Yudhishthira form instead. This means the authors could have still had an exile and return plot if they just used the Horus as a child exile in order to escape Set, but for some reason they chose to use the Mahabharata adult exile form instead, from a totally separate source, giving themselves much more work. Our associate Ben, mentioned previously, has suggested that the author of Jacob's exile could have wanted Jacob to be responsible for angering Esau, and found that local exile stories did not have appropriate plot points, this including the Egyptian sources I mentioned, and that perhaps this changes the nature of the reconciliation to something that the author felt was more suitable for the goal of establishing Esau's acceptance of his new home in Edom. I would add to this that it also makes the reconciliation and Esau's relinquishment seem a bit more complete and fully earned and blessed by God in some ways. It checks more boxes in that regard. One also wonders if the authors simply saw some esoteric power in the Yudhishthira story that they wanted to appropriate and incorporate, to make their own, to draw enduring power from. But this also gets into deeper questions regarding whether this was a late borrowing at all, or was inherited in the deeper past, for example from some influx of Indo-European people bringing lived traditions into Israelite society, which then blended in a more natural way over time to produce the hybrid stories we now find. I hope to touch on these questions in the next video on Abraham. For now, what do you think the evidence points toward? What is most likely to have happened to make this remarkable fusion? Please check out my Patreon if you would like to support the channel and see all of the important topics I have in mind get made into videos, as well as supporting the completion of my second book, Briochan's Tower, in which many mysteries will be solved. My book, Taliesin's Map, is available from Amazon, link in the description. Make sure to like and subscribe for more, as we map the myths.